On today's show, we interview the lawyer, the best-selling author, and the activist, who happens to also be the nephew of former President John F. Kennedy.
And so, my fellow Americans.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. On today's show, we are interviewing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. However, typically when I have a guest on the show, I'm the one that asks the tough questions. But on today's show, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. asks an incredible amount of tough questions. He asks, why is nobody asking Dr. Anthony Fauci about why he funded the controversial Wuhan Lab in China that actually created the COVID-19 virus?
There's questions about the etiology of the illness. Did it come from gain-of-function studies that were funded by Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab?
I told you, on today's show, he asks the tough questions.
Did it come from gain-of-function studies that were funded by Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab?
He asks tough questions about Dr. Anthony Fauci. You see, Dr. Fauci's been the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases since 1984. And since 1986, vaccine companies have been granted a waiver that gives them complete and total immunity against any liability from creating vaccines that actually hurt people.
We passed a law in this country in 1986 that immunized the vaccine industry from liability. So no matter how negligent a vaccine company behaves, no matter how toxic the ingredients that they use, no matter how egregious or grievous the injury to your child, you cannot sue them. So there's no discovery, there's no depositions, there's no incentive for them to make vaccines safer. And that law in 1986 made vaccines insanely profitable.
On today's show, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. asks, why did he only have to get 3 vaccines growing up as a kid? And why did today's kids now have to get 72 doses of vaccines?
Ultimately, most of the people in my generation got 3 vaccines, and we were fully compliant. Today, kids get 72 doses of 16 vaccines, and most of those are completely unnecessary. They're not even for diseases that are casually contagious. The only reason they're on that schedule is because they're so profitable.
On today's show, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. asks, why is the prevalence of autism skyrocketing all across America today?
Autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 kids today.
He asks, why is our country spending $18 billion on developing a COVID-19 vaccine, while spending just $1.48 billion on COVID-19 therapies?
There's now an $18 billion COVID vaccine enterprise from this country alone. Tony Fauci is only spending $1.48 billion on therapeutics. And there's a real bias towards patentable new vaccines.
He asks, why does Microsoft have the patent for an injectable cryptocurrency system using body activity with the patent number W02020060606?
Microsoft patent. What its patent application says is that individuals will inject this chip system, and the system is able to monitor your bodily functions, your heart rate, your breathing rate, your adrenaline pushes, and your EEG. And what they will do then is they will send you a task to perform. And the task could be looking at an ad on TV. You'll get this message on your cell phone. Look at an ad on TV, walk down a certain aisle of a grocery store, listen to the download of a song, or take a vaccine. And when you accomplish that task, you will automatically get a cryptocurrency payment to your payroll account. And so you look around and you say, hey, who the heck would ever do that? Nobody's going to do that. Inject this thing so they can monitor you all the time, and then they can, harvest your data. But at the same time, they're installing 5G that not only surveils us, but it creates this AI, globe where there's going to be driverless cars, etc. 40% of the driving jobs of the jobs in America are driving jobs. So you're going to have 40-50% unemployment after this COVID quarantine is over, and there's a lot of Americans who are going to be starving to death, and they're going to take any form of income, even if it means injecting a chip and doing tasks or that you're assigned by a computer.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, on today's show, we are going to go deep. So grab a pen and a pad as we prepare to enter into the lab and the dojo of mojo on today's show and today's interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Some shows don't need a celebrity narrator to introduce the show, but this show does. 2 men, 8 kids, co-created by 2 different women, 13 multi-million-dollar businesses. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Thrive Time Show.
Now, 3, 2, 1, here we go!
Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, and we'll show you how to get here. Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, now we here. Started from the bottom, now we here.
Yes, 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 and yes. Thrive Nation, on today's show, we have an incredible guest, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, Clay. Thanks for having me.
Well, brother, I have a lot of questions for you. You were recently in Berlin, Germany, where you spoke to a crowd of what appeared to be hundreds of thousands of people. Tell us about this event.
That was an event it was called the Peace and Freedom event, and it was people from all over Europe who are uncomfortable and who have questions with the apparent clampdown of these authoritarian controls that are occurring in conjunction with the COVID pandemic. And, all of the many, many questions, questionable things that are being done, the disproportionality of the response by government agencies, the chronic fudging of the numbers, whether it's the PCR test or the accounting for deaths on death certificates and and all of the other, just questionable things. Listen, we have about 1.5 million people to 2 million people who die every year globally from tuberculosis, which is a respiratory infection that's transmissible by air. There are 10 million people who get that a year, and yet nobody has ever said that we need to wear masks or lock down and bankrupt the entire global economy.
Now, as a quick editor's note, I don't think that most people are aware of this, but Neil Ferguson is the man who initially predicted that 2.2 million people might die from COVID-19. Again, Neil Ferguson is the man, he's the former director of the Abdul Latif Jameel Institute. It is Neil Ferguson that made those nefarious models that predicted that 2.2 million people might die from the spread of COVID-19. Now, it turns out his models were wrong, and it turns out he violated his own recommended lockdowns. But I wanted you as a listener to be able to hear directly from Neil Ferguson about what he believed to be viable options for limiting the spread of COVID-19.
So I think kind of fundamental decisions have to be made by countries as to whether they're going to follow what WHO is recommending and what the Chinese did, namely attempt to suppress all transmission, or alternatively try to mitigate, in some sense control an epidemic, but short of completely stopping spread. And it's an important distinction because in the former case, effectively that's a strategy which, in theory, if it works, could largely prevent deaths from this infection, but would really have to be kept in place for 12 to 18 months until we have a vaccine available at scale. So that has enormous feasibility issues, and can any society really maintain those sort of controls for that long? Clearly has huge economic and social issues associated with it.
And now here is editor's note number 2 before we get back into the interview with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. If you'll remember, we keep hearing on the mainstream media, we need to trust the experts. We need to trust the scientists. Well, it turns out that Dr. Anthony Fauci told President Trump that we should not shut down our borders. And then he said that we should shut down our borders. And Dr. Anthony Fauci said that we should not wear masks. And then he said that we should wear masks. So I thought it would be beneficial for you to hear a quick refresher of what Tony Fauci has had to say about wearing and not wearing masks.
Right now, people should not be walking. There's no reason to be walking around with a mask. Wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. Be as forceful as possible in getting your citizenry to wear masks. Masks are important. We know that masks are really important.
And we had, in 1969, we had a Hong Kong flu that killed 100,000 Americans, which is the equivalent of about 200,000 today. So it had the same infection mortality rates for fatality rates as COVID. And yet we had no lockdowns. We had no masks. Instead we had Woodstock. And life went on. And we didn't destroy 1 million businesses. We didn't destroy half of the black-owned businesses in our country. You didn't see these huge the obliteration of the middle class, the transfer of wealth from the middle class in the upper 0.0001%. And you didn't see the track and tracing and the surveillance and the move to remove digital currency, or to move to digital currencies, and all of these things that have us on a trajectory to really living in a surveillance state, a police state. So I think there's basic questions about the proportionality. There's questions about the etiology of the illness. Did it come from gain-of-function studies that were funded by Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab? There's questions about the etiology of the illness. Did it come from gain-of-function studies that were funded by Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab? There's questions about the etiology of the illness. Did it come from gain-of-function studies that were funded by Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab? Did it come from gain-of-function studies that were funded by Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab? Tony Fauci and Bill Gates at the Wuhan Lab. You know what? I don't know whether they did or not, but there's plenty of evidence that it did. And why is nobody asking Tony Fauci that question? Why is nobody asking, basic questions about PCR tests and about all of the kind of manipulations that we've been seeing? And I think it makes people have questions. It makes people a lot of the mandates that we're seeing, the way that they're imposed on us, completely ignores the democratic protections that would normally accompany these kind of government regulations. Normally, listen, the government has a right, and we want it to have the right to deal with emergencies and to impose martial law for short periods of time. Tell us to stay in our houses because we don't really understand this disease. To tell us to wear masks, even when the science is not really clear on masking, and to tell us to social distance. So we want the government to have that power for short periods of time. So, but particularly periods that are long enough, which is what they told us from the beginning, to let the hospitals gear up, to make sure that there's not congestion or that we don't overwhelm the healthcare system.
Right.
That time period is long past. We're 8 months down the road, and we have time for democracy now. And what would normally happen is that the government would propose a rule, whether it's masking, social distancing, or lockdowns, and say, here's how the rule is going to work. When we get congestion in the hospitals, we're going to go to lockdown. None of that's and there would be a regulatory impact statement that looked at the science, where the government says, here's why we're going to require masks. Here are the studies we're relying on. Here are the expert opinions that explain those studies. Here's why lockdowns are necessary. Here's the science we're relying on, and here's the form of the regulation we're proposing. And there would be an opportunity for the public to comment on those regulations, and then there would be hearings where interested parties like my group, Children's Health Defense, would submit expert testimony and would submit our own studies and say, look, we've been able to find 96 studies in the literature, and they all say that masks don't work. Look, we've been able to find 96 studies in the literature, and they all say that masks don't work and that they could actually make you sicker. And the 4 studies that you're relying on are new studies that are not strong. And, I'm not saying I know whether masks work or not.
Right.
I'm saying we ought to be able to have that discussion. And then there would be a decision, there would be a hearing and a trial where they get to cross-examine our witnesses and we get to cross-examine theirs. And this is what happens for every regulation. But here we're just being told, do what you're told.
I want to ask you something here, because my journey towards learning about you was my wife was telling me about the children's health studies that you do. And at first, I think everybody knows your name. So, you're kind of curious, okay, Bobby Kennedy, what's he saying? And I was one of the first people to think, this Bobby Kennedy guy, he's a little bit crazy. But then when you look into your research, it's abundantly clear that that a lot of the vaccines that have been mandated have caused injuries to children. I know it's common sense for you now because you've been researching this forever, but for our listeners out there who don't know where they can go to prove that some of these previous vaccines are dangerous, where's the best place you would direct our listeners and our concerned parents who listen to this show to go to? Because it seems like right now, Tony Fauci and Bill Gates are obsessed with the idea that everybody has to get a vaccine and that COVID-19 cannot end without a mandated vaccine. Where can our listeners go to find your best stuff about the dangers of vaccines?
They should go to our website, which is children'shealthdefense.org, and we publish all the most recent peer-reviewed studies, and we make them accessible. We explain what they say to the public. Everything we say on that site is sourced either to government databases or to peer-reviewed science. And we take information that is public information and real science, and we make it accessible to the public. And as you say, we've been watching the vaccine schedule grow, and we've been watching this explosion in chronic diseases among our children. We passed a law in this country in 1986 that immunized the vaccine industry from liability. So no matter how negligent a vaccine company behaves, no matter how toxic the ingredients that they use, no matter how egregious or grievous the injury to your child, you cannot sue them. So there's no discovery, there's no depositions, there's no incentive for them to make vaccines safer. And that law in 1986 made vaccines insanely profitable because luckily the industry had a product that the biggest cost to every other medical product is downstream liability. And that was removed. And vaccines are also the only medical product that never needs to be safety tested before being licensed. We passed a law in this country in 1986 that immunized the vaccine industry from liability. So no matter how negligent a vaccine company behaves, no matter how toxic the ingredients that they use, no matter how egregious or grievous the injury to your child, you cannot sue them. So there's no discovery, there's no depositions, there's no incentive for them to make vaccines safer. And that law in 1986 made vaccines insanely profitable because luckily the industry had a product that the biggest cost to every other medical product is downstream liability. And that was removed. And vaccines are also the only medical product that never needs to be safety tested before being licensed.
So you're saying these vaccine companies cannot be sued? Is that what you're saying, sir?
You cannot sue them. And not only that, they do not have to test for safety. And the reason for that is an artifact of the CDC's legacy as the Public Health Service, which was a military agency the vaccine program was originally conceived as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country. They wanted to make sure if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, we could quickly formulate and then deploy a vaccine to 200 million Americans without regulatory impediments. And so they said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to safety test it, so we'll call it a biologic. And we'll make biologics exempt from safety testing. So none of the 72 vaccines are now mandated for our children vaccine doses.
In terms of the number of vaccines that you were required to have as a kid versus the number of vaccines and doses of vaccines that today's kids are required to have, I just want you to take a moment to talk about that. How many doses and how many vaccines were you required to have as a young kid growing up versus how many doses and vaccines are today's kids required to have?
I was required. I was born in '54, and we were required. Ultimately, most of the people in my generation got 3 vaccines, and we were fully compliant. Today, kids get 72 doses of 16 vaccines, and most of those are completely unnecessary. They're not even for diseases that are casually contagious. The only reason they're on that schedule is because they're so profitable to the industry.
Wow. From 3 to 72. Is that right? To 72 now, vaccines?
72 doses of 16 vaccines. So the hepatitis B vaccine, you would have 5 different shots of that. And,
wow.
And then some vaccines are combined. But what happened is, beginning that year, we saw an explosion in chronic disease. Diseases that we didn't know about, like peanut allergies, suddenly appeared in 1989. And autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation to 1 in every 34 kids today. Autoimmune diseases like juvenile diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis and lupus and Graves' disease and Crohn's diseases suddenly appeared. All of those diseases, we went from 12% of American kids having chronic diseases to 54%.
Bobby, you said we went from 1 in 10,000 kids having autism to 1 in 32. Is that right?
Exactly, 1 in 34 today. But
wow.
In my generation, I've never seen anybody with full-blown autism in my generation because they're so rare. They're basically non-existent. You don't see men who are 66 years old walking around the mall with diapers and football helmets, stimming, toe walking, head banging. I'm talking about full-blown autism, not sort of the quirky uncle. What happened to all of these diseases, every one of those diseases is listed on the manufacturer's inserts of those 72 vaccines as side effects of the vaccine. Well, the manufacturers, the one place they tell the truth are on those manufacturers' inserts because you cannot, the only way you can sue them under the Vaccine Act is if they know of a side effect and they fail to list it on their insert. And so there's 420 injuries, chronic diseases listed, including all the ones I mentioned, including autism and, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, all these autoimmune diseases, peanut allergies, etc. They're all listed on inserts as side effects of those vaccines.
Bobby, I want to ask you this here. On today's show, I want to make this show your favorite interview of all time, or at least in your top 10, Bobby. So I brought in a guy by the name of Dr. Richard Bartlett to be on the show today. He's a former top advisor for the governor of Texas, a former top medical advisor for the governor of Texas. And so far, he has treated over 1,000 COVID-19 patients, and not a single patient has died. Not a single patient has died. He's treated over 1,000 COVID-19 patients, and I wanted you two to become fast friends because already this morning he's been on Newsmax, he's been on Glenn Beck, he's everywhere sharing the truth just like you are. So, Dr. Bartlett, meet Mr. Bobby Kennedy Jr.
Well, this is my second time to meet you, Bobby, and I'm a big fan. I appreciate your diligence and standing up for our future.
I'm very, very curious. Are you using hydroxychloroquine?
No, I'm not.
And if not, what are you using?
I'm using budesonide, an inhaled steroid, And I'm also combining that with an antibiotic to protect secondary bacterial pneumonia and aspirin and zinc.
And Bobby, I can send you his study. It's pretty impressive. But, I mean, already today, I think you've had 5 interviews in the past 2 days. And with the new, Washington Times reached out there, and so he's getting a lot of traction. When we get off, I'll make sure I send that to you. But I wanted to see, Dr. Bobby, maybe what questions you might have for Bobby, or Bobby, what questions you'd have for Dr. Bartlett. So I'm just going to get out of your way, and I'll let you, Dr. Bartlett, start first there.
Well, you know, Bobby, one of the things I've been talking about is, of course, we have some effective early therapies that are saving lives. And early treatment works. Comparing Taiwan, where they've had 24 million citizens and only 7 deaths during the 9 months, that's evidence that there's another way to handle this. And so that's been my message, that there's another way instead of the late care only.
What are they doing in Taiwan?
Thank you for asking. They're doing early treatment, and and one of the tools that they're using is inhaled steroids, because COVID's a inflammatory lung disease, and inhaled steroids are an anti-inflammatory lung solution, and it allows the body to fight off the infection. It keeps the cytokines from being released from the lung tissue into the body and killing the multi-organ failures from the cytokine storm. But that's all released from the lung tissue, and so it's not the virus going total body, it's the inflammatory enzymes. And so we've had patients like a lady who has 2 forms of lymphoma, blood cancer. She had radiation a month before. She's on chemotherapy for 5 days, trapped in bed, too weak to get out of bed. Her fever won't break, and she can't sleep. And she calls me on a Friday night and says, I think I got COVID. My granddaughter tested positive today. And I said, I'm sure you do. We called in the breathing treatment. She took it, and her fever broke. She slept all night for the first time in 5 days, recovered over the weekend, and treated and taught her music students an 8-hour day on Monday via Skype, and subsequently had no symptoms and tested negative twice. I consider that a good report, good news, and I am surprised how many people are pushing back at that, because it's against the late care trap that we've been put in.
And at what point do you start treating them? Would you start treating them before the cytokine storm, before the 7-day kind of viral explosion?
A good question. No. Early treatment works, but let me tell you, I got an email from a hospital that emptied their ICU in 48 hours because they started the protocol on late disease, people in the ICU with COVID. And they emptied their ICU in 48 hours. That was 4 months ago, south of San Antonio in Frio Regional Hospital. And I got a report that their ICU has stayed empty for the last 4 months. Can you imagine if worldwide they implemented this strategy and emptied the ICUs around the world in 48 hours?
I would say that that's something that there's now an $18 billion COVID vaccine enterprise from this country alone. That's what we poured into it. And we've only, Tony Fauci is only spending $1.48 billion on therapeutics. And there's a real bias towards patentable new vaccines. And they've declared war on things that, might actually stop the illness.
Yeah.
It's really alarming to watch.
Yeah, so I have a website, budesonideworks.com, and it has the protocol and the white paper that we wrote. But, one thing is they don't
budesonideworks.com, right? Budesonideworks.com. Sorry to interrupt you. Just make sure the listeners get that. So many people are writing that down right now. They have a loved one who's suffering right through this, and they want to get them the treatment. It's budesonideworks.com. Over 1,000 patients have been treated. Not a single person has died. Back to you there, Dr. Bartlett.
Yeah. So if we have a safe medicine that's used on 2-pound preemie babies in the ICU, and is safe on the fragile elderly in nursing homes, and is being used by millions of Americans every day to protect themselves from asthma for 25 years, then it's cheap. It's $3 a treatment. It's readily available at every pharmacy on every corner in the United States. And it's emptying ICUs. I think that would be really good news. So I'm trying to share it. I'm going around the country trying to let people know we don't need a vaccine if we already have a solution.
Bobby, I have a question for you.
That's going to be And it's available by prescription, right? It's not over the counter.
It is prescription, but it's at every. It can be prescribed by any provider, nurse practitioner. We have telemedicine doctors at budesonideworks.com. People can call from around the country, and they can talk to a provider and get the medicine called to their local pharmacy anywhere in the nation.
That is great. And why do you think that Tony Fauci is not jumping up and down for joy and broadcasting this to Americans?
I try not to get in his head. I think it would be too scary. When someone says, we're going to wear a mask as a symbol that we're in this together, and then he doesn't comment on a woman being manhandled, tased, and handcuffed and drug out of a stadium because she's not wearing a mask, where we see pictures of him in a stadium with people shoulder to shoulder with him on both sides without a mask on. I'd say enough of this agenda that he has.
I would say this, Bobby. I want to share this with you, and I apologize if you already know this information. But in Reuters, it was reported that President Trump banned the use of the abortions, or banned the research to be done that called for the use of the aborted fetuses. So essentially, Dr. Fauci's gain-of-function research could not happen in the United States because President Trump said, we're not going to do this kind of gain-of-function research in the United States anymore using this fetal tissue. And so then Dr. Fauci, he's the one who funded the controversial Wuhan Lab, as I'm sure you know. You've probably seen that in Newsweek, where Dr. Fauci funded it. And what I was really disturbed by, Bobby, and I want to get your take on this, is I looked here, and it looks as though the new vaccines being developed by MODERNA actually have the ability to change and modify the RNA of the person who is injected with the vaccine. I want to get your take on that, Bobby. What do you think about that, about the Moderna vaccines having the ability to actually change the RNA of the person who is injected with it?
You know, I don't know enough about exactly, what the implications of that are. It's something that we've looked into, and I don't think anybody can answer that question honestly, because the problem is it's a brand new platform. It's never been used in medicine before. It hasn't been around that long, and people just don't know what's going to happen. What we do know about the Moderna vaccine is very disturbing. For one, there were not animal studies. They went right to human beings. In the phase 1 study, 21% of the people that they gave it to had what they call class 3 reactions, which means hospitalization or medical intervention required. Because they're not transparent, we don't know what that means for those people. But one of them, one of the trial participants, tweeted about his experience, and he said it was the sickest he'd ever been, that he ended up in a hospital, that he lost consciousness, and he only averted really serious injury because his girlfriend caught his head before it hit the ground.
Wow.
That was 21%, and then 100% of the and that was the high dose group. In the low and medium dose group, after the second injection, 100% of the people got sick. Why would you go forward with something? And by the way, these are the healthiest people in America. They don't let people into those trials if they're overweight or if they smoke cigarettes or if they've ever vaped or anything, if they have any diabetes or chronic illnesses or comorbidities. Well, why would you give children who have zero effect from COVID and virtually zero chance of dying from it? Why would you give them a prophylactic medication that's going to make 100% of them sick? It makes no sense. And the only reason is that Dr. Fauci has put billions of dollars of U.S. taxpayer money, and this is his baby. And he is the patron, and he's, any other medication without a risk profile would be dead on arrival.
Right.
And the only way it's alive is because Dr. Fauci his agency owns the mRNA platform, and they get 50% of the royalties from the Moderna vaccine if it makes it to market.
Now, Bobby, I want to ask you this. I want to respect your time, and with 4 minutes left to go, I want to ask you. Zero Hedge reported that the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, known as DARPA, is working on an implantable biochip to detect COVID-19, and it's set to hit the market in 2021. Also, Bill Gates has the patent. And by the way, of all the patent numbers he could have chosen, it's pretty interesting. He chose the cryptocurrency. He chose to choose the vanity patent number W02020060606. He has a cryptocurrency system using body activity. And I'm not sure if you've seen that or not, but what do you think about DARPA and Bill Gates having implantable biochips and cryptocurrency-related patents connected to vaccines? What do you think about this?
I think it's scary, and I think we're headed more and more towards a surveillance state. The one that you mentioned, which is a Microsoft patent. What its patent application says is that individuals will inject this chip system, and the system is able to monitor your bodily functions, your heart rate, your breathing rate, your adrenaline pushes, and your EEG. And what they will do then is they will send you a task to perform. And the task could be looking at an ad on TV. You'll get this message on your cell phone. Look at an ad on TV, walk down a certain aisle of a grocery store, listen to the download of a song, or take a vaccine. And when you accomplish that task, you will automatically get a cryptocurrency payment to your payroll account. And so you look around and you say, hey, who the heck would ever do that? Nobody's going to do that. Inject this thing so they can monitor you all the time, and then they can, harvest your data. But at the same time, they're installing 5G that not only surveils us, but it creates this AI, globe where there's going to be driverless cars, et cetera. 40% of the driving jobs jobs in America are driving jobs. So you're going to have, 40, 50% unemployment after this COVID quarantine is over. And there's a lot of Americans who are going to be starving to death. And they're going to take any form of income, even if it means injecting a chip and doing tasks or that you're assigned by a computer. And, they're turning us, it's really frightening. They talk about transhumanism, about integrating machinery with human beings. And, it's really a way to turn human beings into slaves. I don't know what's going to happen with those chips. I know there's a lot of people working on them. Bill Gates has 3 different investments in these kind of subdermal chip systems. Microsoft has that investment. And it's frightening. It's beyond 1984. It's beyond Orwell. It's beyond Kafka. It's beyond imagination. But it's a very, very frightening world and a dark, dark place that they have us headed.
Well, Bobby, final question here for you. I know Dr. Bartlett is honored to be here on the show with you, as am I, and so I wanted to give him the opportunity, because he's smarter than me, Bobby. He's a doctor. The opportunity to ask you a final question here.
Bobby, I have 2 questions. One is contraindications. There's contraindications for the flu shot, and people don't, there are reasons why they should not get the flu vaccine every year, and people don't get it because of complications. But for them to push a mandatory vaccine on everyone makes no sense when you look at the reality. Other vaccines have contraindications, and people are dropped out of getting it. The second thought is rotavirus, the vaccine that recently was put out and killed babies, and then they found out it was causing intussusception, bowel obstruction, and it got pulled from the market after it went through all testing. And I heard Anthony Fauci, I heard that he said that we might, if he has overwhelming evidence, he may not complete the phase 3 trials. Have you heard that?
The rotavirus vaccine is, they pulled the first version of it, which was Rotarix, But they allowed the second one, which is Paula Offit's vaccine, Rotatech, to stay on the market, and it also causes intussusception. The data indicate that it actually kills and injures more people than the deaths and injuries that it averts in this country particularly. And it has a porcine retrovirus in it that causes wasting disease in pigs. And nobody knows what that's doing to our children. So this is the insanity of it. The flu vaccine, and this is why I think the entire idea of a COVID vaccine is a real fantasy. I don't think they'll ever find a vaccine, and the companies now know this. But their testing is not designed to give us a vaccine that actually prevents the disease. Their new testing, and Dr. Hazeltine has written about this in the Washington Post, is designed, what he called, the title of the article is Designed to Succeed. They're designed to show that the people they give it to are less likely to get a serious case. In other words, the symptoms will be slightly milder, but they'll still be able to transmit the disease. And, this is what you have the whole charade, the canard that you have with the flu vaccine. This is why I've said from the beginning, they're never going to get a vaccine for coronavirus. We've had the flu vaccine for 90 years. And that vaccine, according to the British Medical Journal, which has done a series of meta-reviews, that means literature reviews about all the scientific studies on flu, the Cochrane collaboration, which is the ultimate arbiter of pharmaceutical science, which has done its own meta-reviews. And here's what the BMJ and the Cochrane collaboration say. Number one, at best, you have to give 100 flu shots to avert one case of the flu.
Wow.
This is what the science says. Number two, and they think that's exaggerated because some of the literature, most of the literature is industry generated.
Wow.
Number two, there is zero evidence that the flu shot averted to any hospitalizations or any deaths, which was the whole justification for it, that it would stop deaths in the elderly. And there's no evidence that it does that. Number three, people who get the flu shot are 6 times as likely to transmit the flu as people who don't. Oh, you don't stop transmitting it. You're just asymptomatic, and you're more likely to transmit it because you don't know you're sick.
Bobby, I am just so you're like a encyclopedia of all the knowledge related to these vaccines, and I want to help you gain traction with your cause. That's why I reached out to you, and I'm going to be praying for you specifically. What specifically can I pray for, sir, or what is the hope that you have? Like, how can I help you advance your cause? Are you wanting to connect with the president? Is that what you need to do? Do you need to? What do we need to do? What do you feel like that you need to do, sir?
If you're going to pray for me, just pray for strength and, integrity and all of the things that, I think are the gifts that God gives us. So, we need to build a community. We need to be able to communicate with each other. This is not going to come from, help is not going to come from above. And it's going to come from, us being able to organize and resist the pharmaceutical cartel and the pharmaceutical paradigm and this whole biosecurity agenda. And, and the problem is that we're censored. I'm very grateful to you for allowing this discussion. I have an Instagram account with about 700,000 followers, but I can't, when I post on there, nobody gets my posts anymore. And we're censored on Facebook. I'm suing Facebook at this point and Zuckerberg for, because they censored us in conjunction with the government, and that's illegal.
Yep.
And in coordination with the government, and we're censored on all the media. And if the public knew, if I were allowed to speak to the public,
yep,
people, we would turn around very quickly.
That is
none
so
of
true.
us who know what's happening is allowed to speak. We're all gagged, and So pray for us that we can find a way to speak to, God's people.
Absolutely.
And to open their minds and to open their ears.
Absolutely. Well, I will do that, sir. And I thank you so much for your time and for joining our listeners today. You really are a great American. We appreciate your research and your work, sir.
And Doctor, I would love to have you on an Instagram Live. Would you be willing to do that?
I'd be honored.
Wow. And so that just happened. Ladies and gentlemen, what do we need to do with this information? Well, what we need to do is we need to share this show with as many people as possible. It is the truth that will set us free. So I encourage you to text out this show to everybody in your contact list, because once people understand that the models that were used to justify the lockdowns, that those models were wrong, once people know that the models that were used to predict that 2.2 million people would die of COVID-19 were wrong, then there's no reason to be scared. And once people know that the PCR tests produce false positive results all the time, there's no reason to continue the lockdowns. And once people know that Bill Gates and Dr. Fauci were at the very epicenter of the creation of the COVID-19 virus, and that Dr. Fauci actually used U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund the controversial Wuhan Lab where the coronavirus was created. Once people know that Bill Gates and Microsoft have a patent for a cryptocurrency that is injected into the human body. I mean, once people know all this stuff, there's no longer a reason or a justification to be shut down. In fact, there's a justification to go outside and to share the truth everywhere. And it is the truth, again, that will set us free. Folks, I encourage you to share this show in the air everywhere. We need to stop sitting around asking ourselves what our country's going to do for us. And we need to start asking ourselves, what can we do for our country? President Trump can't do this alone. It is up to you and me to share this information all across this nation.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
And now, after a little bit of help from John F. Kennedy, let's end this show with a boom. Here we go. 3, 2, 1, boom.